The winter wind had a way of howling across the plains that made even the strongest men feel small. Out here in the old American frontier, where life was measured by grit and heart rather than gold or fame, the nights were longer than the days, and the silence could play tricks on a person's mind. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops of weathered barns. The fences stood crooked under the weight of ice. The dirt roads had frozen into glassy paths that dared anyone brave enough to travel them. In such a land, survival was never promised, and warmth was more than just a comfort. It was a matter of life and death. She arrived on that bitter night, riding a half-starved horse that looked just as weary as its rider. Her cloak was torn at the edges, her hands stiff from the cold, and her face carried the look of someone who had gone too long without rest. The storm had caught her unprepared, and every gust of wind threatened to push her right off the saddle. When the cabin light appeared in the distance, flickering faintly against the snow,
Out.
It was not just a sign of shelter, it was the last glimmer of hope she had left. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and crackled, filling the single-room dwelling with a glow that softened the rough edges of its wooden walls. The cowboy who lived there had spent years working cattle, mending fences, and keeping mostly to himself. His bed was made of heavy timber, draped with thick wool blankets, and positioned close to the stone hearth where the heat lingered strongest. He had learned long ago that in the wilderness, the warmth of fire was the only reliable companion a man could count on. What he didn't expect was that, before the night was through, he would be sharing that warmth with a stranger who carried secrets deeper than the snow that followed her. She knocked only once, her hand trembling as she did, and by the time the door swung open, she nearly fell into his arms. Her lips could barely form words, and her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. He didn't ask questions then. Out here, you didn't leave anyone to freeze on your porch, no matter who they were or where they came from. He guided her inside, sat her near the fire, and let her breathe in the comfort of heat as the storm screamed outside like a pack of wild coyotes. The silence between them at first was heavy, broken only by the hiss of logs burning and the low whistle of wind through the cracks in the cabin. She clutched the blanket he handed her, staring into the flames as though they might swallow her whole. The cowboy noticed how her eyes wandered restlessly, as if she were listening for something beyond the storm. There was a story behind those eyes, a road that had led her far from home, but he knew better than to press too soon. She whispered finally, her voice soft but steady enough to carry weight. "I didn't mean to trouble you. I just needed a place where the cold couldn't follow." Her words were simple, yet they hinted at more. People didn't ride through the wilderness in the dead of winter unless they were running from something or toward it. He nodded slowly, pulling his hat from his head and setting it on the table. "A roof's meant to keep out the storm. Tonight it's keeping out more than just snow." Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was enough to stitch the silence together. The fire grew brighter, shadows shifting across the room, and the cabin felt both small and endless at once. When the night deepened, the cold crept through the walls despite the fire's best effort. She shivered beneath the blanket, her teeth chattering faintly. The cowboy noticed and pulled another quilt from the chest at the foot of his bed, spread it across the frame and motioned toward it. "You'll sleep warmer there. The fire reaches better on that side." She hesitated, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket already around her. Pride and caution held her back, but the raw truth of the cold left little choice. She rose slowly, moving toward the bed, each step measured as if she were crossing into unfamiliar territory. She sat down first, testing the weight of the mattress, then finally lay against it, her body curling beneath the layers of wool. The heat that clung to the bed was a relief that made her close her eyes almost instantly. The cowboy took his place by the fire, stretching out on the rug with his hat pulled low over his brow. He knew the bed would have been warmer for him too, but some lines weren't meant to be crossed, not yet. Still, as he lay there listening to the storm batter the cabin, he felt a pull he couldn't quite explain. There was something about the way she had appeared at his door, sudden and desperate, that left him restless. Hours passed, but sleep came slowly. He shifted, turning to look at her in the dim glow. She wasn't asleep, not fully. Her breathing was uneven, her eyes flickering open now and then, as though she expected something or someone to come crashing through the door. He realized then that whatever she had escaped from was far colder than the snow outside. She finally spoke again, her voice breaking the quiet. "Do you believe a person can ever outrun their past?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke curling from the fire. He didn't answer right away. He had his own ghosts, buried deep in the dust of trails and the silence of lonely rides. He knew the weight of regret, the shadow of choices that clung even when the miles stretched on. Last he said, "Out here, the pass rides just as hard as you do. But sometimes, if you keep moving, it gets tired before you do." Her lips pressed into a faint smile, though it didn't last long. She turned her gaze back toward the flames, her eyes reflecting a storm fiercer than the one outside. He could see it now. She wasn't just running from the cold. She was running from something that might still be on her trail. As the cabin walls rattled under the force of the wind, a sound broke through that neither expected. It was faint, almost buried beneath the storm, but sharp enough to draw both their eyes toward the door. The horse outside neighed anxiously, hooves striking the frozen ground. Then came another sound, a creak, not of wind, but of wood under weight. The cowboy rose quietly, his hand reaching instinctively for the rifle propped against the wall. The woman sat up in the bed, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her face pale as the snow outside. She didn't need to say a word. The fear in her eyes told him enough. Whoever she had been trying to outrun might have just caught up. And in that moment, the fire no longer felt warm, the bed no longer safe. The night was far from over, and neither of them knew what waited beyond that door. The cowboy stood motionless, listening hard, every sense sharp in the silence that followed. The storm was still raging outside, the wind pushing snow against the walls like fists, yet that sound had been different. It was heavier, slower, like boots pressing down on wood. His horse's cries only made it clearer that something wasn't right. He glanced at the woman, and she was staring back at him, wide-eyed, her breath coming fast. He didn't need to ask. Whoever she was, whatever she was running from, she had just heard the same thing he had, and she already knew it spelled trouble. He moved toward the door without a word, rifle in hand, each step deliberate. The cabin floor creaked under his boots, reminding him just how fragile this little shelter was against the wilderness or against men. His fingers brushed the edge of the latch, then stopped. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he pressed his ear against the wood, steadying his breath. Nothing, only the storm. Yet his gut told him the night was no longer theirs alone. The woman clutched the quilt around her shoulders as though it were armor. Her face was pale, but there was something stronger beneath the fear. Her jaw was set, her eyes never leaving the door, as if she were preparing herself for the moment it would burst open. The cowboy took note of that. She wasn't just a lost traveler caught in the snow. She was someone who had lived long enough with danger to recognize its footsteps. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The fire crackled louder in the tense silence. When nothing else came, the cowboy finally stepped back from the door, though he didn't lower his rifle. He turned to her and asked quietly, "Who's out there?" Her lips parted, but no words came at first. She seemed to be fighting with herself, torn between telling him and keeping it locked away. Finally she spoke, her voice low and tight. "If I tell you, you'll wish I had kept it to myself." His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. She didn't. Instead, she pulled her knees up under the quilt and leaned against the bedpost, her gaze fixed on the fire. He recognized the look people only carried that kind of weight when their past had been chasing them for a long time. He lowered himself onto the chair near the hearth, rifle still in his hand, the shadows painting hard lines across his face. He wasn't a man of many words, but he knew enough to let her silence sit. If she spoke, it would be when she was ready. Until then, all he could do was listen to the storm and wait for the truth to come on its own. After a while, she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself, "I didn't plan to end up here. I didn't plan to end up anywhere." The cowboy tilted his hat back slightly, studying her. "Nobody plans on freezing to death either. You're lucky the storm led you this way." Her eyes flicked to him, a faint glimmer of something unreadable there. Lucky. That's one word for it. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the shutters, but the sound of the horse moving restlessly came again. The cowboy rose, moving to the window to peek through a narrow crack. Snow swirled in every direction, blinding and thick, but he thought he caught the outline of something darker at the edge of the tree line. He couldn't be sure. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned back, his voice steady but firm. "Who's following you?" She tightened her grip on the quilt, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. But finally she said, "Men who don't understand the word no. Men who believe everything in their path belongs to them. Once they set their mind on something, they don't stop until they've taken it." Her words hung heavy in the air. The cowboy understood enough. Out here in the frontier, law was a thin thread stretched across miles of wild land, and men with power or guns often lived as if no law existed at all. A woman alone on the road would have little chance against them. He paced back toward the fire, leaning the rifle against the wall, but keeping it within easy reach. "You'll stay here till the storm breaks. After that, you'll have to decide which way you're riding." She shook her head slowly. "There's no riding away from them. They'll keep tracking me. They always do." Her voice carried a weight of exhaustion, not just from the storm, but from running too long without rest. He knew what it meant to be hunted in one way or another. A man didn't survive on these plains without having something or someone on his trail. The storm roared louder, rattling the door as if testing its strength. The cowboy stoked the fire higher, letting sparks jump up the chimney. 8. He noticed the way her eyes softened briefly in the glow, like the heat was the first safe thing she had felt in months. But then the crack of wood outside split the calm, sharp and unmistakable. Both of them froze. The cowboy moved first, grabbing the rifle, his boots crunching on the floorboards as he crossed to the window again. He saw nothing but the storm's fury, yet he knew what he had heard. He turned slowly to her, his jaw set. "They're closer than you think, aren't they?" he asked. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she lowered her gaze, and that silence told him more than any explanation. The hours dragged on, every gust of wind a reminder that they weren't alone. The cowboy kept watch, pacing the cabin, listening for any sign beyond the storm. She drifted in and out of rest, though each time her eyes closed, they snapped open again at the smallest sound. Sleep was a stranger she could no longer trust. As dawn's faint light began to press through the cracks of the cabin walls, the storm eased, its voice softening into a whisper. The world outside lay buried under a thick sheet of snow, and the quiet that followed was almost more unsettling than the storm itself. The cowboy pushed the door open cautiously, stepping out into the sharp morning air. His breath rose in clouds as he scanned the tree line, the open field, the path leading away from the cabin. The world was white and still, but something in the snow caught his eye. Tracks heavy. Deliberate tracks. Boots. More than one pair. They led toward the cabin and then circled back, as though whoever made them had been watching, waiting, deciding. He closed the door firmly behind him, his eyes darker now as he met hers. They were here, not long ago. Her face went pale again, but she didn't look surprised. Instead, she nodded faintly, almost as if she had expected it all along. The cowboy set the rifle against the table and leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You'd better tell me everything, start to finish. Because if they're coming back, I need to know what kind of men I'm up against." Her eyes lingered on him for a long moment, the firelight reflecting a storm of its own inside them. She pulled the quilt tighter, her voice unsteady, but carrying truth this time. "They're the kind who won't stop until they get what they came for. And I'm the one they came for." The room fell silent again, the fire burning low, the weight of her confession hanging heavy between them. The cowboy knew then that the storm outside had only been the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. It carried the shape of men who left boot tracks in the snow. The cowboy sat back in his chair. Eyes narrowed on the woman, as if he were trying to read not just her words but the spaces between them. She had given him enough to know danger was near, but not enough to prepare him for it. He could tell by the way her shoulders stayed tight, by how her hands clung to the quilt, that there was more she wasn't saying. Out here, truth was as valuable as food or fire, and half-truths could get a man killed. He stoked the fire higher, the sparks flying like restless spirits up the chimney, and let the silence linger until she shifted uncomfortably under it. At last she began, speaking slow, her voice almost caught between a confession and a memory. They work the trails between towns, robbing, taking what they want. It started with cattle and horses, but then they began hunting people. I made the mistake of standing in their way. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He'd heard of gangs like that before, men who thought law was something that only applied to others. They left destruction behind them like wildfire, How many? He asked. 5, maybe 6, she whispered. I never stayed long enough to count, but I know their leader. He's worse than the rest. He enjoys the chase, doesn't just take. He makes sure you remember what he took. Her words carried a shadow, a weight of something personal, though she didn't spell it out. The cowboy leaned back slowly, letting the rifle rest across his knees. His instincts told him this wasn't just her problem anymore. If those men had circled the cabin once, they'd circle again. And when they came back, it wouldn't be the storm pounding against the walls. The woman fell quiet again, and the cabin seemed smaller, the air heavier. The cowboy thought of the tracks outside, the way they lingered near the tree line. Whoever made them hadn't been rushing. They'd been watching, waiting, maybe even listening. He knew the kind of men who could stand in the cold for hours if it meant cornering their prey. He wondered how long he had before they decided to come closer. By noon, the storm had lifted enough to show the endless sweep of white outside. The land stretched bare and quiet, every sound carrying farther than usual. The cowboy stepped out to the barn, his boots sinking deep into the snow. His horse whickered softly, tossing its head, still unsettled from the night before. He rubbed its neck, scanning the edges of the field. No movement, no sound. But the tracks from earlier were still etched into the snow, leading away toward the hills. He shoveled feed into the trough, his mind turning over what the woman had said. 6 men against 1 cabin wasn't a fair fight, and he knew it. Yet something in him resisted the idea of turning her out, of sending her back into the cold, with danger on her heels. He had lived most of his life alone, but he couldn't look at her fear and call it none of his concern. Back inside, she had wandered from the bed to the table, running her fingers absently over the rough wood. Her eyes moved toward his belongings, tools, a few old books, a small stack of letters tied with twine. The cowboy noticed her curiosity and spoke before she could ask. Nothing worth stealing here. Just the things a man needs to get through the years. She gave a faint smile, though it didn't last. That's what makes you different from them. They don't think about years, only about what they can take today. The cowboy studied her carefully. And what is it they want from you? Her eyes met his, steady now, though pain flickered behind them. Everything. He said nothing, but the fire popped sharply, filling the silence with its own voice. That night, the unease grew heavier. Cowboy sat near the fire with his rifle across his lap, eyes never far from the door. The woman lay on the bed, though sleep didn't seem to find her easily. She turned often, sometimes sitting up, sometimes clutching the blanket like a shield. In the quiet between the fire's cracks and the wind's sighs, he heard her whisper prayers under her breath, asking for strength, asking to be unseen. Just before dawn, the sound returned. Not a creak this time, but a whistle, faint and deliberate, cutting through the cold. The cowboy froze, his hand tightening on the rifle. The woman sat up instantly, eyes wide. She knew the sound. He could tell by the way her lips parted, by how her body stiffened. They're here, she whispered. The cowboy moved to the window, careful to stay low, and peered out. At first, nothing but pale morning light and the white stretch of land. Then he saw it movement near the tree line. Figure on horseback, dark against the snow, watching. Another shape appeared beside it, then another. His stomach sank. The woman had not been exaggerating. He ducked back from the window, jaw set. Her voice cracked as she answered, "No, they found us." The cowboy didn't argue, began checking the rifle, loading it with steady hands. His mind ran fast, weighing options. 6 men against 1 was no fight he'd choose. Yet if he sent her out, they'd take her, and he knew she wouldn't come back. That wasn't a burden he was willing to carry. The day dragged with the weight of waiting. The riders never came close. Not yet. They stayed near the hills, sometimes disappearing, sometimes reappearing. It was a game, and he knew it. They wanted to test him, to let him feel the trap closing slowly. He kept the fire low to hide the smoke, rationed the wood, and listened for every sound beyond the walls. The woman spent the hours pacing, her nerves raw. At one point she asked, "Why are you helping me? You don't even know my name." The cowboy didn't look up from where he was cleaning the rifle. Out here, names don't mean much. A person's worth is measured by what they stand for when the storm comes. She stared at him for a long time, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally, she murmured, "I stood against them once. That's why they won't stop." He He glanced up at her, eyes narrowing. "What did you stand for?" Her answer came quietly, but with steel underneath. "I stood for those who couldn't." The cowboy let her words hang, but he respected them. It explained the fire he saw in her, even when fear pressed down. She wasn't just running from men. She was running from the memory of what she had fought for and perhaps lost. By evening, the riders had vanished from the tree line, but the cowboy knew better than to believe they were gone. He set extra wood by the fire, laid his revolver on the table, and sat with his back to the wall, where he could see both the door and the woman. And she sat across from him, her face pale but steady now, as if some quiet resolve had settled into her. "They won't wait forever," she said. He nodded once. "Neither will I." The firelight flickered between them, throwing shadows across the walls. The night pressed in heavy, filled with the weight of footsteps that hadn't yet come, and words that hadn't yet been spoken. Both knew that the silence outside was only the pause before the storm broke again. And when it did, the cabin would no longer be just a shelter from the cold. It would become the battleground for everything she was trying to outrun. The night settled heavy over the plains, thicker than the storm that had passed. The cowboy kept his eyes on the door, his rifle never far, every flicker of firelight making the shadows jump. Outside, the world lay quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that hummed with danger. Snow muffled the land, hiding sound, hiding movement, but he knew they were still out there. Men like that didn't give up. They circled, they waited, and then they struck when a man's guard slipped. The woman hadn't spoken much since sunset. She sat near the bed, her hands knotted together, her face pale in the fire's glow. Every so often, her eyes flicked to the window as though expecting faces to appear against the glass. Her unease seeped into the room, mixing with his own steady watchfulness until the cabin felt too small to hold it all. When the wind shifted, carrying a faint creak from the trees, the cowboy stiffened. He rose, stepping silently to the window, and peered through the narrow crack. At first he saw only darkness pressed against the snow, but then he caught at a shadow sliding between the trees. A rider, moving slow. Another shape followed behind. His jaw tightened. They were closer now, testing how near they could come before being noticed. He pulled back from the window and moved to the table, checking the revolver he had laid there earlier. His movements were calm, practiced. He had faced threats before, though never with another life depending on his choices. The woman's eyes followed him, her voice finally breaking the silence. "They're closing in, aren't they?" He didn't answer right away. He simply loaded the revolver, each click ringing louder than it should have. Then he looked at her, steady and sure. "They're not gone. It's enough to know." She swallowed hard, clutching the blanket around her. "You don't owe me this fight. If I leave now, maybe they'll let you be." The cowboy shook his head slowly, his tone firm. "You walk out that door, they'll take you. And if they don't stop at that, they'll come for me too. Men like that don't leave witnesses. You're safer here." Her lips pressed tight, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. The fire burned low, casting longer shadows across the walls, and every sound outside seemed sharper now. The cowboy's ears caught faint snaps in the snow, muffled voices carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew the tone. Mocking, confident, the way men spoke when they thought they already owned the night. He crossed to the door and slid the heavy bar into place, then gathered what little he had to prepare. Extra wood stacked near the hearth, water set within reach. The rifle propped beside him. The cabin was sturdy enough, but it wasn't built for siege. If they wanted in badly enough, they'd find a way. His job was to make sure it cost them more than they were willing to pay. The woman rose and moved closer, her steps slow. "Can't fight them all," she said softly. "Maybe not," he replied, his eyes locked on the door. "But I can make them wonder if it's worth the try." The hours dragged, the tension stretching thin as wire. The cowboy fought sleep, though his body ached from the stillness. He kept watch through the cracks in the shutters, glimpsing movement here and there. A flicker of torchlight at one point, quickly snuffed. The shadows of men crouched low against the snow. They were tightening the circle, waiting for the right moment. The woman stayed by the fire, her gaze never leaving him. He could feel the weight of her trust pressing on him, a trust he hadn't asked for but couldn't turn away from. He thought of the quiet life he had built here, the years of solitude, and how quickly it had all shifted with a single knock at the door. Now he was tied to her fate, whether he liked it or not. Near midnight, the first real sound broke the silence. A sharp crack would splintering outside. The cowboy snapped to attention, rifle in hand. The woman gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. He motioned for her to stay low, his eyes locked on the door. Another crack followed, then the heavy thud of boots stomping against snow. They weren't hiding anymore. He moved to the window, pressing his eye to the gap, and saw them clear now. 4 figures, maybe more, moving through the trees. Torches lit their faces just enough to show the cruelty etched there. They weren't rushing. They were enjoying the slow choke of fear, knowing he could see them coming. The woman whispered, her voice trembling, "It's him, the leader." "I know that stance anywhere." The cowboy didn't take his eyes off the figures. "Stay back. Don't open that door." Her silence was her only answer, though her eyes glistened with fear. The men outside circled the cabin, their voices louder now, calling taunts that twisted through the night air. They spoke of fire, of smoke, of promises that chilled more than the snow. The cowboy stayed steady, his rifle aimed at the window, waiting for them to test the walls. The fire inside had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dim red glow. Shadows stretched long, wrapping around the woman as she sat frozen near the bed. She clutched the quilt, like it could shield her from the storm of men outside. The cowboy's breath came slow, steady, his finger resting near the trigger. Every second that passed was another step toward the moment when waiting would no longer be enough. Suddenly, a heavy pound shook the door, the wood straining under the force. The woman flinched, a cry escaping her lips. The cowboy steadied his stance, rifle trained. Another pound followed, louder, sharper, rattling the bar that held the door shut. Laughter rose outside, cruel and unhurried. They were playing with him, testing how long he could hold. The cowboy's voice cut through the fear, calm but commanding. "Stay low. Don't move unless I tell you." The pounding stopped, replaced by footsteps crunching around the side of the cabin. He turned quickly to the back wall, knowing they might test the windows next. He shifted position, every sense on edge. Then came the sound of glass shattering, the small window near the table breaking under a heavy strike. The woman screamed, ducking as shards fell across the floor. A hand pushed through the opening, groping for the latch. The cowboy swung the rifle and fired. The blast tore through the night, echoing across the plains. The hand yanked back, a shout of pain following outside. For a moment, silence fell. Then the shouts rose, angrier now, louder, filling the night with the promise of violence. The cowboy reloaded fast, his eyes cutting to the woman. "It started," he said, his voice flat but steady. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she nodded, clutching the quilt tighter around her shoulders. She knew there was no turning back now. The men outside began circling faster, their boots crunching against the snow, their voices carrying threats. The cowboy kept his rifle trained, his body a coil of steel, waiting for the next strike. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the storm building again, but this time it wasn't snow waiting to fall. It was blood and fire. And in that tense silence between the echoes of the gunshot and the next attack, the cabin stood like a lone outpost against the dark, its walls trembling under the weight of men who would stop at nothing. The woman's breathing was ragged, her body rigid with dread. The cowboy's jaw clenched, his grip tightening. He knew the worst was still to come. The night was only beginning, and the fight for survival was about to break wide open. The cabin sat in silence again, but it was the kind of silence that had weight to it, like the stillness before a storm breaks open. The cowboy kept his rifle steady, his eyes scanning every shadow that flickered outside the window. He knew they were out there waiting, circling like wolves.
Ow.
One shot had only stirred their anger. Now they would come harder, stronger, and there would be no bluffing them away. The woman crouched low by the bed, her face pale in the firelight, her hands gripping the quilt as though it could keep her safe. She wasn't crying, though. There was too much steel in her for that. Fear showed in her trembling, yes, but so did something else, defiance, the same spark that must have made her stand against those men in the first place. The cowboy noticed it, even in the middle of the tension. Outside, torches flared again, their orange glow breaking across the snow. Some jeered, some cursed, and one deep, steady. Cruel spoke with the authority of a man who knew his prey was cornered. That had to be their leader. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had dealt with men like this before, men who used fear the way other folks use tools. He had no illusions about their intentions. Hey, they weren't here for bargaining. They were here to break the door, take the woman, and burn whatever remained. Boots crunched near the back wall again. Scraping sound followed, then a pounding on the shutters. The cowboy swung his rifle toward the noise, ready to fire, but the pounding stopped just as quickly as it began. They were toying with him, pushing his nerves, trying to make him waste bullets before the real fight began. The woman whispered, her voice tight. They won't stop until they're inside. He didn't look back at her, his eyes still on the window. Then we make sure they don't get in easy. He moved across the cabin, checking every latch, every crack. He pushed a trunk against the smaller window, dragged the table closer to the door. The cabin wasn't much, but it was what they had. She rose to help, her movements shaky but determined. Together, they stacked whatever they could find, chairs, spare wood, even the heavy chest at the foot of the bed. When it was done, the cabin looked less like a home and more like a barricade. Every flicker seemed alive, as though the cabin itself knew what was coming. The cowboy crouched near the window again, peering out. The torches had drawn closer now, spreading in a wide half-circle around the cabin. The riders weren't hiding anymore. He counted at least 5, maybe 6, their shapes tall and menacing against the snow. One figure rode at the center, a broad-shouldered man with his torch raised high. Even at a distance, his presence carried power, the kind that forced weaker men to follow. The leader called out, his voice low, but carrying easily through the night. "You've got something of mine in there." His voice rang clear in answer, steady as iron. "You'll get nothing from this cabin but lead." The silence that followed stretched thin, broken only by laughter rolling out from the gang. It wasn't the laugh of men amused, but of men who believed they already owned the night. The woman's face went rigid at the sound, her eyes closing as though hearing old ghosts rise with the voices. Then came the first strike. Crash against the door, so hard it rattled the bar holding it shut. He stayed steady, rifle aimed, waiting. Another crash followed, then another, wood splintering with each blow. They weren't testing anymore. They were coming. He glanced back at her, his voice sharp but calm. "Stay low. Don't move unless I tell you." She nodded, her body pressed against the wall, her hands clutching the quilt like it was all she had left in the world. The pounding grew louder, the cabin shaking with each strike. The cowboy knew it wouldn't hold forever. The gang outside shouted, their voices wild, the sound of boots crunching closer. The leader's voice cut through it all, steady and commanding. "Break it down, burn it if you have to. She's mine." The woman's eyes filled with terror at those words, but behind it was fire too. She wasn't only afraid of what would happen, she was furious that it had come to this. She rose half to her feet, her voice breaking but strong. "I'll fight them myself before I let them take me." The cowboy turned to her, his expression hard but steady. "You won't fight them alone." The next crash split the doorframe. The wood cracked, the bar strained. The cowboy raised his rifle, steadying his aim. His breath slowed, every muscle tense, his heart beating in rhythm with the pounding outside. The gang shouted louder, boots stomping, torches flaring. The cabin walls groaned under the weight of their assault. The woman crouched again, tears brimming but not falling. Her eyes fixed on the cowboy like he was the last solid thing in a world breaking apart. And then, with one final crash, the bar snapped. The door shuddered on its hinges, the wood splintering. The next blow would send it flying wide. The cowboy set his feet, his rifle raised, his jaw tight. The woman's breath caught, her hands gripping the edge of the bed as though bracing for the storm to break. The night outside roared with voices and fire, and in that last moment before the cabin was torn open, everything held still, the silence of dread, the weight of fate pressing down. The knowledge that the fight was about to begin.